Well, welcome to MBA 507. This is some supplemental material to show the practical applications of what some of the topics we've been studying this semester. I have two articles. One is the first one I'm going to read is Inflation in the United States by John Steele Gordon. Went to Vanderbilt University. What else does he do here? He writes a column for Barron's, and he writes from the vault for the American Bankers Association. Okay, and the other one I have is economic, finance is a weapon of war, dealing with the sanctions that are being placed on the country of Russia due to their invasion of the Ukraine. So some timely articles, and again, every now and then I'll stop and inject something that'll relate it to materials we have been covering and will be covering. Okay, here we go from inflation in the United States. Money is just another commodity, no different than petroleum, pork bellies, or pig iron. So money, like all commodities, can rise and fall in price, depending on supply and demand. But because money is, by definition, the one commodity that is universally accepted in exchange for every other commodity, we have a special term for the fall in price of money. We call that inflation. As the price of money falls, the price of every other commodity must go up. In other words, it takes more dollars to buy the same thing that it did last week, last month, last year. Okay. What causes the price of money to fall? The answer is very simple: an increase in the supply of money relative to other goods and services. As the Nobel Prize winning economist Milton Friedman explained, quote, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon in the sense it is and can be produced only by a more rapid increase in the quality of money than in output. So if you don't have the growth going hand in hand with the fall of money, the fall in the price of money, you've got troubles. Okay. And again, there's a difference between monetary policy and fiscal policy. Okay. Monetary policy deals with the supply of money. Fiscal policy deals with interest rates and other finance factors. Okay, continuing on with the article. Inflation has been around almost as long as money itself. In the disastrous 3rd century, inflation racked the Roman Empire as emperors, unable to pay the bills, increasingly debased the coinage. The once proud silver denarius became a copper coin, only thinly plated in silver. Okay. Cheaper money, less valuable money. Roman merchants demanded more and more denarii in exchange for their goods as the coin's intrinsic value declined. We'll be talking about value of bonds while we talk about values of bonds and value of stock. And again, those are just other commodities. From an economist viewpoint, everything is a commodity, even labor. Only when the Emperor Diocletian, who ruled from 284 to 305 AD, and was one of the great men of the late antiquity, reformed the taxation and coinage system, did a degree of economic stability return to the Roman world. In the 16th century, as the gold and silver pouring into Spain from the New World caused a rapid rise in the European money supply relative to the production of goods and services, prices rose about 400% over the course of the century. So 400%, 100 years, 4% a year. Yeah, that's evenly distributed though. There was no inflation in the American colonies for the simple reason that the money supply was only a hodgepodge of foreign coins. The most common was the Spanish dollar. Tobacco, warehouse certificates, beaver and deer skins, wampum, and paper money printed by the colonial governments. Much trade was conducted on a barter basis. When the American Revolution began, both the new state governments and the Continental Congress had to find ways to finance it. Having limited ability to borrow and to levy taxes, they quickly began printing money. As fiat money, money that is money only because the government says it is money, that's fiat, just like the automobile, F-I-A-T, always does. So the so-called continentals, the continental dollar, depreciated rapidly in value, becoming essentially worthless by the end of the revolution. That's back in 1776. The phrase "not worth a continental" became part of the American lexicon for more than a century. Between 1775 and 1779, the Continental Congress issued no less than $225 million in continentals, a huge sum relative to the size of the American economy. Prices doubled in 1776 and doubled again in both 1777 and 1778. Doubling 3 years in a row. That's 200, 400, 600% increase, six-fold increase. By 1781, prices were up 80-fold relative to the continental dollar. In addition to the problem of the fiat money, the Continental Army forced farmers to sell their produce at whatever price the requisitioning officer chose to put on it. They were paid in quartermaster and commissary certificates, which also circulated as money at a fraction of their face value. Nothing backing them up. The need to deal effectively with the massive debts incurred in the Revolution was one of the main drivers of the Continental Constitutional Convention that met in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. The new Constitution and the monetary and tax systems put in place by Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury, would keep inflation at bay until the great crisis of the Civil War. That would be 1850s, 1860s. Roughly 75 years, we were all right. Again, wars cost money. And they have to be financed. Until the Civil War, paper money was printed by banks, and it circulated at a value relative to the perceived soundness of the issuing banks. Again, there was no Federal Reserve at that time. The United States minted copper and no standard U.S. currency. The United States minted copper and silver coins, but not high-value gold coins until after the California gold strike of 1848. In 1837, it set the price of dollars at $20.66 per troy ounce of gold, putting the country on the gold standard. War, by far, is the most expensive of all government operations, and both the Confederate and United States government, the Union, faced unprecedented financial stresses in funding during the Civil War. How each of them met the challenge helped determine, in no small degree, the outcome of the war. Governments have only three ways to fund operations. They can tax, they can borrow, and they can print. Both governments, the Union and the Confederacy, did all three, but the particular mix was very different. And we'll get into later on in the semester, if we have time, about financing mix. How much should be debt? How much should be equity? The northern states had a much more advanced economy, more industrialized, and a well-established financial system in place. The Confederacy was basically rural, agricultural, tobacco and cotton farming. Okay. As a result, the U.S. was able to throw much of the cost of the war onto the future debt, borrowing money. In 1860, the national debt had stood at $64 million. By 1866, it was at $2.7 billion, and about 5% of the North's population had invested in federal bonds. So the North was able to raise 2/3 of its revenue by borrowing. The Confederacy, with far less liquid capital and a much smaller middle class and few large banks, could raise only about 40% of its revenue through bond sales. It was the same with taxes. The federal government, Union, sharply raised taxes, its main source of income before the war, sharply raised tariffs, its main source of income before the war, and excise taxes. Tariffs are taxes on goods coming in, going out of the country. Excise taxes are on certain a tax on certain commodities like alcoholic beverages, cigarettes, gunpowder. Tea was Boston Tea Party was because of an excise tax. Okay, it also taxed gross receipts and imposed a stamp tax on legal documents. The country's first income tax was passed in 1862. Altogether, the North raised 21% of its revenue through taxation. The Confederacy, with less developed cash-poor economy, was able to raise only about 6% of its revenue through taxation. This would be akin to financing with equity from the people that are, citizenry could be looked as owners of the country. Okay, are they putting up the money, or are they getting it from creditors, borrowing it from other countries, or other businesses, or selling bonds to the citizenry? Thus, the federal government, the union, needed to use the third means of raising revenue, simply printing fiat money. For only about 12% of its revenue, in the course of the war, the Treasury printed $450 million in greenbacks, so-called because they were printed in green on the reverse side. This caused inflation, as fiat money always does, and prices rose over the course of the war in the North by a manageable 75%. Again, the government prints more money, increasing the money supply without a parallel increase in the size of the economy. You're going to have inflation. If they print more money, if the economy is growing, you'd have to increase the money supply. Okay, and as long as they do it at equal rates, you're okay. It's when the money supply goes up and the growth in the economy doesn't go up by as much, that's when you're going to have inflation. Or even worst case, the economy declines and they print money, the gap gets bigger, the inflation gets worse. The South had to meet fully 50% of its revenue needs by printing money. And again, compared to the union's 12%, I believe we said, wasn't it? I'm looking for it. 12%. The South had to meet fully 50% of its revenue needs by printing money. State and city governments also printed money. And because the South lacks proper paper mills and state-of-the-art printing facilities, counterfeiting flourished. Altogether, the South printed about $1.5 billion in fiat money, 3 times as much as the Union, despite having only 12% of the circulating currency before the war and 21% of the banking assets. So you can see where it's headed. And again, hindsight is 20/20, but you know who lost the Civil War. The result was catastrophic inflation for the Confederacy. Prices rose 700% in the South in just the first 2 years of the war. As the war continued, inflationary spirals deepened and the Southern economy began to spin out of control. Living standards fell sharply while hoarding, shortages, and black market spread, eroding the popular support for the war. Again, think of the economy. You need to have financing. People, even farm, if you're a cotton farmer or a tobacco farmer, you have to get the seeds, you have to get the plants, you have to get the tools, the equipment. Again, we had, at the time down there, it was slave labor. So it didn't cost much. Once you purchased the slave, there was an ongoing cost other than feeding them and keeping them in tools. You didn't have hourly wages, but the cotton had to be harvested. It had to be processed into cloth. So there was some machinery there, or actually most of it was shipped up to New England. And it takes money to finance the machinery, to pay the workers in the plant. So when the economy breaks down and the costs go out of sight with inflation, it slows the gears, the wheels of the economy, and people suffer. With the end of the war, the Confederate bonds and paper money became worthless. Indeed, redemption of the bonds was explicitly forbidden by the 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868. The South, deeply impoverished by the war and dependent on agriculture and extractive industries, would be essentially a third world country inside a first world country well into the 20th century. By 1879, greenbacks had been made redeemable in gold, and the country had returned to the gold standard. The gold standard, where the government stands ready to buy or sell gold in unlimited quantities at a fixed price for its currency, makes inflation impossible. If the markets begin to have doubts about the value of the currency, it will increasingly trade it for gold, as would a foreign central bank. Consequently, the government must rein in the money supply to avoid being forced off the gold standard. The gold standard was very popular with bankers and industrialists as it protected the value of their assets, plus protected them against increasing costs because of inflationary pressures. But it was equally unpopular with the chronic debtors, such as farmers, who wanted to be able to pay back their loans with cheaper money, the time value of money. Take a time out here and think about when you got your first house or when you'll be getting your first house. I'll share with you my story. When I got my first mortgage, I was sweating whether I would be approved or not. And it was, right up at the max of, I forget whatever the percentage was, 25 or 38% of my take-home pay. And within 2 or 3 years, after a couple of raises, my mortgage stayed constant. This was before they had variable rate mortgages. It was all fixed. And, I got raises year by year by year. So my percentage of my mortgage payment, actually, of my take-home pay, went down each and every year. And, after 5-10 years, it's a drop in the bucket compared to what it was when I first got in the house. So again, cheaper money, inflation, again, the gray hair, I've been around a couple centuries, in 2 centuries, you folks, I'm thinking my undergraduates, they're all born after 2002 or whatever, 2000, late 1990s. I've seen inflation several times in my life. I can't remember. The one time it was, my first brand new car was a 1973 Subaru, was $2,600. Now I don't think you can touch them for $26,000, probably more like $36,000, tenfold. I got out of college, I was making, $6,000 a year, and thought I was rich. But again, a gallon of gas was 60 or 70 cents. A new car was $2,600. Well, Subaru, but a bigger car. Let's see, my buddy bought a Chrysler. They're about $5,000, $5,000. So yeah, if you got a little bit bigger, more expensive car, it was half your annual salary or so, maybe, depending how much you made. I remember when I started working as a teenager, $1.25 an hour, $1.50 an hour, and I had money because prices were cheaper. You could get a loaf of bread for 75 cents. You could get a quart of beer for 45 cents, I think. So inflation, time value of money go hand in hand. Pulled in 2 directions, Congress, as legislatures in democratic countries often do, try to have it both ways. It put the country fully back on the gold standard on January 1st, 1879, soon after passing the Bland-Allison Act in 1878, an act requiring the Treasury to buy on the open market between $2 million and $4 million worth of silver every month and coin it in a ratio of 16-1 with gold. That was roughly the free market price of silver at the time. But as silver production soared in the 1880s, thanks to such strike as a Comstock lode, and the price of silver began to drop, reaching about 20-1 by 1890. So that goofs up the ratio with gold. That year, Congress passed the Sherman Silver Act, mandating the Treasury buy and coin 4.5 million ounces of silver every month, just about all the silver the country was producing, still at the ratio of 16-1, and this was trying to shore up the price so they would control it. Something very similar to what the Hunt brothers tried to do back in the 1960s or 70s or 80s. Lamar Hunt and his brothers tried to corner the silver market. With the gold standard keeping the value of the dollar steady and the silver policy greatly increasing the money supply, the government managed both to forbid inflation and to guarantee it at the same time. That's what you get with the compromise. Nobody wins. Inevitably, Gresham's law kicked in. With silver worth 1/20th the price of gold in the marketplace, but the 1/16th price when coined as money, people increasingly kept the gold and spent the silver. Perfect illustration of Gresham's law. Good money, bad money. Gold began to trickle out of the treasury. The very large budget surpluses of the 1880s masked the government's schizophrenic monetary policy. But when the crash of 1893 marked the onset of a new depression and government revenues plunged, the trickle of gold out of the treasury turned into a flood. Only some very fancy footwork by the country's leading banker, J.P. Morgan, kept the U.S. from being forced off the gold standard in 1895. They did it back in 1961 or 2 with President Kennedy. The next year, William Jennings Bryan ran for president on the expressly pro-inflation platform. In one of the most famous American political speeches ever given, he demanded that, quote, "You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." Bryant had lost badly to William McKinley, who campaigned on the platform of sound money, and the country would stay on the gold standard until 1933. I remember back in the 80s, somewhere mid-80s, I guess, late 80s, inflation was running rampant. Interest rates were up around 15, 16%. I was a tax auditor at the time, and the corporations really didn't mind the high interest rates because the inflation rate was so high. And he said, we went from paying 5 and 6% interest rates on our loans to now, we're paying 20% interest rate, but the rate of inflation is 15%. So we're still, effectively at a 5% interest rate because the rate of inflation, it's cheaper dollars, and things are relative. Keep in mind, everything in the economy. That's the thing I love about our friends, the economists. They say, there's so many variables, and they say, hold everything constant and change one variable, and let's see what happens. Well, theoretically, it's a nice exercise, but it has, and it does have some use, but it totally ignores reality. Mm-hmm. The outbreak of World War I caused many disruptions in the American economy, even before we entered the conflict 2.5 years later. With Russian grain exports blockaded, demand for American wheat soared, as did the Allied order for ships, railroad rails, munitions, and other war material. As a result, prices rose nearly 100% in the first 2 years of the war. When the United States entered the conflict, the United States government set up a series of boards to negotiate prices with producers to see that prices stayed in check while assuring a supply of vital materials. The Price Fixing Committee set maximum prices for which materials such as coal and steel, but these maximum prices quickly became the standard prices. The only commodity that had a fixed price by statute was wheat. With the end of the war, 20 months later, the American economy soon returned to normal. Prices fell back to more modest levels, partly due to the very sharp but short recession of 1920 to 21. The beginning of the Great Depression in 1929 brought not inflation, but deflation, which can be even bigger problem. Can be an even bigger problem. When inflation is serious, people tend to spend money as soon as they get it to avoid even higher prices in the future. But in a deflationary environment, people tend to postpone purchases in order to take advantage of lower prices in the future, further depressing the economy. I'm going to read that paragraph again and then make some comments on it. That's how important it is. The beginning of the Great Depression in 1929 brought not inflation but deflation, which can be an even bigger problem. When inflation is serious, people tend to spend money as soon as they get it to avoid even higher prices in the future. But in a deflationary environment, people tend to postpone purchases in order to take advantage of lower prices in the future, further depressing the economy. Again, with future value, present value, time value of money is at play here. But think about in a bigger picture of what they just said here. With inflation, people buy things as soon as they can afford to do it because they're afraid if they wait, they're going to pay more for it next week, next month. So what does that do? It increases demand for consumer goods. So it keeps the economy running. Okay, so the economy is growing, and that's what our president is saying. No, our economy is good. Our economy is good. But don't worry about inflation. The inflation is the effect of our economic growth, is what he's trying to tell us. And then on the other part, the other side of the coin, deflation. People postpone purchases, hoping to defer the purchase and get the item they need or want at a lower price somewhere in the future. Well, what does that do? That contracts the economy because people aren't buying goods and services. So businesses don't make as much. They lay people off of work, wages go down. And again, you've got the snowball effect. Again, in the economy, everything is intertwined, interrelated. And that's what makes it interesting. That's what makes it complicated and hard to fix. The Federal Reserve, okay, back to the article. The Federal Reserve had pushed up interest rates in 1928 and 29 in order to tamp down speculation on Wall Street. But after the crash in 1929, the Federal Reserve should have lowered them aggressively. And in the words of the late governor of New York, the governor of the New York Federal Reserve, Benjamin Strong, flooded the street with money. Instead, it kept interest rates high. After Britain was forced off the gold standard in 1931 and the world economy spiraled downward, the Federal Reserve still kept interest rates high to defend the gold standard in this country. As a result, the American money supply fell by a third, greatly exacerbating the depression. To be sure, the huge number of bank failures in these years, more than 5,000, also contributed to deflation. With the onset of World War II and the U.S. becoming the arsenal of democracy, inflation would have quickly returned as the American economy experienced shortages in many vital commodities. But strict wage and price controls were put in place, and many commodities such as sugar, butter, red meat, shoes, and gasoline were severely rationed. Some commodities, in particular short supplies such as rubber and building materials, simply vanished from the marketplace. What's one of our 5 principles at work here? Markets are generally right. Okay, so depending on supply and demand, somebody's going to step in. Again, look what's happening now with the gas prices so high. Oil companies are going to drill and explore and refine more. Okay, because it's worth their while. When oil is $30 a barrel, they're barely breaking even. Who wants to break even? But while the wage and price controls kept wartime inflation down to about 25%, they did not eliminate the inflationary pressures. They only postponed them. When President Truman ended the war and ended wage and price controls at the beginning of 1946, inflation came roaring to life. The U.S. experienced the greatest peacetime inflation up to that point, as non-governmental spending rose by 40%. But the supply of goods could not expand nearly as quickly, as industry needed time to switch over to peacetime production. In 1946, prices were, plus during the war, you have all that pent-up demand. People aren't buying clothes because of the uncertainty. They're not buying cars. Well, you couldn't buy a car. And it took several years after the war for Detroit to retool to start making passenger cars again. This is just like we have now. Used cars were almost as expensive as new cars, or the same price. Supply and demand, basic economics. In 1946, farm prices rose 12% in a single month and were 30% higher by the end of the year. Many economists had thought that with the end of the wartime government spending, the depression, government spending. I just saw a scrappy kid from Scranton who now lives at 1300 Pennsylvania Avenue. Yesterday in Philly, I saw the clip today on the news. Government spending doesn't cause inflation. There's an economist, many economists would like to argue with them. The government spending does what? Affects supply and demand. You're competing with the government. They can afford to pay any price they want. They can print more money. You can't. You can't increase your paycheck. So if they want it, they're going to get it. They'll pay any price. And again, supply and demand. Let's see. Many economists had thought that with the end of the wartime government spending, the depression of the 1930s would return. It did not for several reasons. One was that during the war, with many during the war, with many products such as household appliances and automobiles unavailable, demand for these commodities built steadily. Further, with few things beyond necessities available in the marketplace, the savings rate was unprecedented. In 1940, Americans had held about 4.2 billion in savings, about the same as it was in 1929. In 1945, personal savings amounted to an astonishing 137.5 billion. So 425 25 30 times higher. No, 35 times higher. Yeah, you can't buy goods, you may as well save the money. Wages too increased once controls were ended, because they did put wage and price controls in during the war to get more munitions and tanks and jeeps for the war effort, rifles, uniforms, boots, all that stuff, helmets. As corporate profits in 1946 increased 20%, labor unions demanded higher wages and went on strike to get them. In January 1946, fully 3% of the workforce was on strike at the same time, including in the steel, automobile, electrical, and meatpacking industries. What does that do? It's going to drive prices up. Looks like inflation's starting to come back. By the late 1940s, with the government usually running modest budgetary surpluses and industry once again on a peacetime footing, inflation subsided and the economy grew. Again, money and supply grew, but the economy grew parallel to it. It's when you have that gap is when we have trouble. The economy grew quickly, doubling between the end of the war and the mid-1960s, but it was not to last. When Lyndon Johnson acceded to the presidency on the death of he wanted to complete the New Deal. He pushed through a number of programs, including Medicare, Medicaid, Head Start, and the Mass Transit Act. Government spending. These new programs caused a breathtaking rise in non-defense federal expenditures. Between 1965 and 68, they rose by a third, from 75 billion to 100 billion. Because of the Vietnam War, military expenses went up as well, from 50 billion to 82 billion. The new government spending, I should say, inevitably caused an increase in inflation, which had been minimal since the immediate post-World War II war years. This vicious cycle developed, with lenders demanding higher interest rates to protect them from inflation, while the Federal Reserve pumped up the money supply by buying federal bonds to keep interest rates down. So you have one governmental unit causing inflation and a quasi-government unit, the Federal Reserve Board, buying bonds to keep rates down, artificially maybe, in manipulating them. In 1974, Congress passed the Budget and Impoundment Control Act, as misnamed an act of Congress as is possible for an act to be, the Budget and Impoundment Control Act. It effectively removed the president as a player in the budget game by ending his power to impound appropriated funds. With Congress in full control of spending went out of control. Put the fox in charge of the henhouse, huh? In 6 years preceding the act, with the Vietnam War raging, annual deficits had averaged $11.3 billion. In the first 6 years after the act, with the war over, they averaged $54 billion. And what are we talking about? Government spending. I should take a copy of this and send it to the White House. Let somebody there read it. Or have somebody read it to somebody. By 1980, the inflation rate hit 13.5%, the highest peacetime rate in history. Well, we got 7.5, 7.9 I've been hearing, and we've got some time to go yet. Maybe we'll tie it, maybe we'll beat it. Hopefully, and I pray we won't go there, like somebody said, it's transitionary, but So was the Ice Age. And that only lasted, 10 million years? Although the national debt increased by 2.5 times in the 1970s, so great was inflation in that decade that the debt actually declined as a percentage of gross domestic product. Only when Paul Volcker became chairman of the Federal Reserve in 1979 and Ronald Reagan became president in 1981 did inflation end. The Federal Reserve sharply increased interest rates, slowed down the economy, pushing the economy into a deep recession. Unemployment hit 10.8% at its peak, the highest since the 1930s, but it worked. Inflation, which had been 13.5% in 1980, was down to 4.1% in 84 and would stay low for the next few decades. When the economy went into a deep recession with the bursting of the housing bubble in 2008, however, the government began running unprecedented budget deficits. Again, they're spending. When you have the bad thing, it's a catch-22. When the economy contracts, when you have a recession, depression, the need for government services, food stamps, welfare programs to take care of the people, unemployment goes way up. And again, unemployment goes way up. People aren't paying as much income tax. So the government is in a difficult place. Their expenses go up and their revenues go down. The national debt, and again, if they raise taxes, what does that do? That takes more money out of the private sector that would grow the economy. And, that every time they have cut taxes, individual income taxes in our history, the present income tax since 1913, every time there's been a tax cut, it has resulted in a expansion of the economy, very good growth rates. When they raise taxes, it contracts the economy. The theory is if you grow the economy big enough, that there'll be more people paying tax. Yes, everybody will be paying less tax, but with more people paying tax, more money will come into the treasury. When you raise taxes, people won't even the upper middle and upper class people, they have enough money to live on. They're going to say, why should I work when the government's going to take 75 cents every dollar I make in taxes? So there's no incentive for somebody. Now you're essentially working for the government. The national debt, let's see, again, the national debt was over $10 trillion in 2010, would double by 2017 with the onset of the COVID pandemic in 2020. Deficits soared further as the government sought to mitigate the effects of shutting down much of the economy. The national, and again, tax revenue, and plus costs skyrocketed for government because they gave the stimulus payments. They call them stimulus payments. They were just paying people not to work. What does that stimulate? It stimulates laziness. The national debt now stands at $29 trillion, about where it was in 1945 relative to as a percentage of gross domestic product. But this breathtaking increase in the money supply did not, at least immediately, set off inflation. For while inflation is a monetary phenomenon, it is also a psychological one. Why? Markets are generally right. Why are gas prices shot up so much? Because of the future. The market is future oriented. People are looking what's going to happen next month, next 2 months, next 6 months, next year. Okay? And reacting to it. When the expectation of inflation becomes widespread, it becomes self-fulfilling prophecy. That prophecy was fulfilled in 2021 with the Biden administration continuing the pandemic relief, which discouraged many from seeking work and restricting oil and gas production. Inflation set in. Now, hold on. This article is from January of this year. This is before the invasion. Okay? Keep that in mind. So we've been hearing the last week that the inflation is all Putin's fault and the oil prices are all Putin's fault. Well, Putin is a pretty powerful fella if he can control that, and other presidents can't control that. In fact, by blaming Putin, what is Biden saying other than he can do things I can't do? He can control things I can't. Supply chain disruptions also contributed. By December 2021, consumer prices were up 7% on an annual basis, the highest in 40 years, while the producer prices were up 9.6%, the highest since that statistic has been compiled. And the expectation of further inflation is now deeply embedded in the economy. Regardless of this, the Biden administration is still pushing hard for its Build Back Better plan, which would add at least another $5 trillion to the national debt over the next decade. And again, increasing the money supply, furthering fueling the fires of inflation. The president has airily said that Milton Friedman is no longer in charge. But unfortunately for the Biden presidency and for the U.S. economy and the American people, Milton Friedman was right. Maybe he's not in charge anymore, but he was right. Create too much money and you get inflation. You're witnessing the proof of that right now. A very interesting article. Hope you enjoyed it. All right, the second article comes under this. This is from this week's, the March 7th, Bloomberg Business Week, when finance is a weapon of war. Okay, and in fact, if you've been paying attention, Putin has been saying that the sanctions are, in fact, a declaration of war because you're harming his country. Okay, special report here. The war between Ukraine and Russia is playing out in two theaters, on the former's soil and in the latter's financial system. The European Union, the U.S., and a handful of American allies in Asia have responded to Russia's invasion of Ukraine with financial sanctions unprecedented for a target of the size of Russia. The steps taken to isolate it within the global financial system are aimed at punishing President Vladimir Putin by sowing chaos in his country's economy. You think he cares about that? In the first week of the conflict, Russia's central bank was struggling to contain the fallout of on its own side of the border, while Ukraine's was able to maintain a semblance of stability even as it rallied global financial resources around its defense efforts. Central banks have been key players in the war finance since their inception. You can go back to the establishment of the Bank of England in 1690s, and you can see directly where that establishment was in a large part in order to be able to finance wars against Louis XIV and also help stabilize the economy during those wars, says Paul Post, a political science professor at the University of Chicago. The Central Bank of Russia was indeed central to Putin's strategy in the years leading up to the invasion since 2014, when he annexed the Crimea. The Ukraine's Crimea, the Western nations responded with sanctions aimed at making it more difficult for Russia to transact in the U.S.-dominated global financial system. The repercussions from that episode were severe. Combined with the collapse in oil prices that year, it sent the ruble tumbling more than 40% against the U.S. dollar, forcing the Russian central bank to enact drastic interest rate increases that pushed the economy into recession to combat inflation. From that point, the bank embarked on a massive accumulation of foreign exchange reserves. Again, the sanctions that hurt Russia and Putin in 2014 annexation of the Crimea section of Ukraine, he's learned from that. He started stockpiling. Okay, so these sanctions are going to take a while to work. The stockpile, now the fourth largest in the world at around 643 billion, could be deployed to defend the ruble in the event of another crisis. And I think they're in a crisis now. They have been trying to bulletproof their economy from sanctions since 2014. Well, what I just said, says Elena Rybakova, deputy chief economist at the Institute of International Finance in Washington. The bulletproofing came at a significant cost. Hundreds of billions of dollars brought in via oil and gas exports were salted away instead of being reinvested in the economy. Risk requires a return, which has average growth of 1% a year since 2014. So that's not good. In that sense, Russian citizens have already been bearing the costs of the current conflict for many years, since 2014. That's why the new raft of sanctions, and in particular the extraordinary targeting of Russia's central bank, is such a big deal. Putin was counting on the world's, and especially Europe's, reliance on Russian energy exports and investments by a host of marquee foreign corporations to prevent governments from taking extreme measures in the opening days of the invasion. It didn't work. Just days after Russian troops marched into Ukraine, the U.S., European nations, and other allies topped off a barrage of harsh sanctions by cutting off access to hundreds of billions of dollars of Russian reserves parked in their jurisdictions. China did not follow suit. All right. With that, Putin's war chest was effectively cut in half overnight. At this stage, Fortress Russia is going out the window, Rybakova says. The move to freeze reserves significantly limits their options in terms of helping the financial sector looking after common Russians, financing the war effort. The financialization of warfare is bringing the social character of money to the fore on a global scale. Let's just back up to that other paragraph read a few seconds ago. Where does it say? Didn't work. Just days after Russian troops marched into Ukraine, the European topped off the barrage by harsh sanctions. Why wasn't that done when he was amassing all those troops on the border? It may have got his attention and maybe changed his thinking, or at least give us a head start on the sanctions kicking in. Like somebody said, give it a month or so. Well, in a month, a lot of Ukrainians are going to die. A lot of Russians are going to die. Stupidity. The financialization of warfare is bringing the social character of money to the fore on a global scale. Or, as Bloomberg opinion columnist Matt Levine put it, Russia's foreign services consist, in the first instance, of a set of accounting entries. But in a crisis, the accounting entries don't matter at all. All that matters are relationships. And if your relationships get bad enough, then the money is as good as gone. That's for the assets parked. Half of his war chest, what do they call his stockpile? Half of it was in foreign banks, not in Russian banks. And if he puts it in ruble, the sanctions have made the ruble less valuable. It has been severe. To halt the ruble's free fall without depleting its greatly diminished stock of foreign reserves, Russia's central bank instead hiked its benchmark interest rate to 20%. Rates in this country are, around 3% now? Stagflation is sure to follow as the economy sinks into recession, while a weaker currency propels already elevated inflation higher. So they're going to have some problems. And even if, regardless of what the outcome is, they're going to have, some big problems getting back to normal. Russian officials were also forced to put stringent controls in place to deter capital flight and stem a bank run that drained some $14 billion in deposits in a single day. Measures include freezing the assets of all non-resident investors, making it impossible for them to liquidate their holdings, and a ban on converting rubles into other currencies. What do we say about Gresham's law? The ruble's no good. Nobody wants them, not even the Russians. Little irony there. Huh? And companies bringing in export revenue from overseas were instructed to sell 80% of their foreign exchange, effectively drafting businesses to help put a floor under the ruble. That's what Russia was doing. The U.S. and Europe also moved to disconnect several major Russian banks from SWIFT, the capital SWIFT, the global messaging system used to facilitate payments between financial institutions. That will force them to figure out complicated workarounds, i.e., they're going to have to go through China. If the objective of all these moves is to precipitate a financial crisis in Russia, the strategy seems to be working. One telling indicator, the cost of insuring Russia's government debt has shot up, with one gauge showing the likelihood of a default had climbed to as high as 65%. In terms of economic war, this is jumping into the void, says Yakov Fagin, an associate director of the Future of Capitalism program at the Bergen Institute in Los Angeles. Even if President Vladimir Zelensky succeeds with a big assist from his friends abroad in repelling Russia's attack, Ukraine's economy will suffer heavily from the physical destruction of the military incursion. Of course, that will give a boom to labor, trade union laborers, and building companies. Yet, unlike in Russia, the central bank at least has been able to maintain liquidity in its domestic financial systems to support the nation's defense. On day one, it put a new twist on the central bank's traditional war finance role by setting up a crowdfunding account to process donations from foreigners. As of March 2, it has raised almost $200 million. Ukraine's finance ministry sold 8.1 billion hryvnia, or 277 million, of war bonds, paying 11% interest to international investors on March 1. It also made a regularly scheduled interest payment of about $300 million on outstanding debt. They did that to give confidence to these investors about those 11% bonds. Again, bonds paying what? 2% now, 3% if you're lucky, 11% because of the risk. If Ukraine doesn't come out of this, you may not only not get your interest, you may not get your principal back. International assistance is flooding in through other channels. The U.S. and European countries have already authorized billions of dollars worth of funds and equipment to aid Ukraine's defenses, and more is on the way. For the first time in its history, the European Union is supplying arms to a country at war using a financial vehicle it calls the Peace Facility. Yeah, just like the peacekeeper, Putin called his troops special military operations peacekeepers. Smooth operations at the National Bank of Ukraine offered a modicum of stability on the ground in Kiev in the first several days of the invasion, even as air raid sirens were ringing and residents fled to bomb shelters. On day 7, the central bank eased previously instated restrictions on foreign currency withdrawals for individuals, lifting the cap to 30,000 hryvnias, or almost $1,000 a day. Supplies of basic goods are running low in cities sustaining heavy damage from Russian assault, such as Kiev and Kharkiv. According to Natalia Shapoval, chairman of the KSE Institute at the Kiev School of Economics. But in the areas of the country where civilian infrastructure hasn't been targeted, business is more normal and prices have not been affected. Macro financial stability is important, and the ability of the central bank and Ministry of Finance to be in control is important, says Shapoval. Excuse me. Russia, despite the heavy sanctions, still retains its oil and gas exports as a critical financial lifeline. We have a situation where energy prices are high, and they may get even higher. And this is a help to the Russian economy, says Vasily Astrov, an economist at the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies. This is a difference in the situation of 2014. That was they annexed the Crimean Peninsula, when it was a double shock of Western sanctions and falling energy prices. So we have Western sanctions. Of course, they're bigger and more severe than they were in 2014. But in 2014, the energy prices were going down. Now energy prices are doing the reverse, headed up. The U.S. and the European Union have been loath to take any action that would result in a serious disruption of oil and gas supplies, as they would be on the receiving end of some of the economic repercussions. Russia, $5 at the pump. Russia provides approximately 40% of Europe's natural gas, and the European Central Bank has estimated that a total shutoff would result in economic hit equal to 3% of gross domestic product. The resulting spike in oil and gas prices would also stoke inflation, which has become a political problem. But Ukraine's allies can keep climbing an escalation ladder if they so choose, according to Rybakova, the Institute of International Finance, Institute of International Finance, and it's located in Washington, D.C. The European Union is looking at ways to limit access to its ports and waters for Russian vessels, expanding on an earlier ban of Russian flights into the bloc's airspace. And on March 2nd, the White House announced restrictions on exports of oil technology to the country aimed at degrading Russia's status as a leading energy supplier. That means that Halliburton. I hope the French have told Schlumberger to stop helping the Russian extraction of oil. The extent to which the newfangled techniques of financial warfare will prove an effective substitute for old-fashioned troops and tanks remains to be seen. Julia Freelander, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and former U.S. Treasury Department official, worries that the outcome could be a lose-lose situation. Quote, I think this is going to be a conflict that is going to go on for a very long time, and we could very much see it completely destroy Ukraine. That's my biggest fear. You empower Russia through sanctions, but then you destroy Ukraine in the process, and no one gets anything. So, an interesting take on that. Hopefully, the news you hear every day makes a little bit of sense to you now, and that's about it. So, if you saw these videos, these are optional, not mandatory for you, and hopefully you got something out of it. And again, trying to relate some of the topics we've covered and will cover, and also to just expand your knowledge. Like my favorite economists say, push back the frontiers of ignorance. My favorite economist, that's a quote, the late Walter E. Williams. God, I miss him. And when you understand things, when you have more knowledge, you get a better understanding of things. Okay. That's it for the two articles.